Hello, everyone, and welcome to Heat Emergencies and You. My name is Priya Penner, and I'm with the Partnership for Inclusive Disaster Strategies. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a brown woman with long, curly black hair. And today I'm wearing a pink shirt and a blue-gray cardigan.
Al seminario de las emergencias por calor y todo. Me llamo Priya Penner y formo parte de The Partnership for Inclusive Disaster Strategies. Utilizo los pronombres ella. Soy una mujer morena con el pelo negro y rizado. Hoy llevo una camisa rosa y un cardigan azul grisáceo.
And before I pass it off here, I do want to just encourage folks to ask questions about today's content. And you can do that by using the Q&A box. If you can't access the Q&A feature, again, email those questions to us and we're happy to read them out aloud. And again, let us know if you have any technical issues by letting us know in chat. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Colin and Herman.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you for being here. My name is Colin Killick. Visual description, I'm a white man in my mid-30s with shoulder-length hair and a short beard, wearing a blue shirt and glasses. I'm the executive director of Autistic Self Advocacy Network. We are a national grassroots disability rights organization run by and for autistic people, and excited to welcome you all here today. I wanted to start off by thanking the funders of this project, particularly the With Foundation, who made all of this possible. We also have a great advisory group of people with IDD who've given some really valuable feedback to shape the project and what topics we've covered. And so just going to briefly give you an overview of the project. The problem we're trying to address, which is heat emergencies. We're going to talk today about heat emergencies broadly, the dangers of extreme heat, and what we can do to protect our communities from extreme heat. And really, this project was designed to address a real problem, which is, while there's a decent amount of information out there about heat emergencies, the risks of heat, there's very little that talks about the specific risks that people with disabilities in general and people with intellectual developmental disabilities in particular face. And there's also very little of the safety material, or indeed the policy material that's written about heat, that's written in a way that is accessible for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And so the goal of this project was to change that, to produce documents and materials that would be effective in promoting policy and in keeping people safe. And to talk more about that, I will hand off to Herman.
This is Herman. Thank you so much, Colin, and everyone for attending. Again, my name is Herman Perotti. I use he, L pronouns. I'm a brown-skinned Puerto Rican man joining you from Philadelphia, the land of the Lenni Lenape people. I'm wearing a denim long sleeve shirt with the Partnership for Inclusive Disaster Strategies logo. And the partnership is the nation's disability and disaster hub. All things disability and disasters. For this very important, timely project, in the next few weeks, please expect a recording of this webinar along with a toolkit in plain language, both English and Spanish, for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities to better understand what heat emergencies are, its dangers, and ways of protecting themselves. And alongside that, you will also receive a policy brief in English, Spanish, and plain language in both English and Spanish, with a number of breaking down the reasons heat is more deadly for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, and a number of structural and social factors, not everything, but high-level risk factors like intersectionality, disability exclusion in heat planning, being unhoused, schools and prisons and segregated congregate settings, and policy recommendations for lawyers, advocates, and policymakers for immediate and long-term actions, and also for public health. Be on the tune out for that, but please, I'll pass it to my colleague Greg to get us started again on covering what are heat emergencies and its dangers to our community.
Thank you so much. I am Greg Robinson. I am the Director of Public Policy for the Autistic Self Advocacy Network. A brief visual description: I am a brown-skinned man with dark curly hair and glasses with a white, blue, and black checked button-down shirt, in front of a blurred out background because my apartment is not the neatest. I'm going to be talking today about what heat emergencies are, why they are an issue of interest for intellectually and developmentally disabled individuals. I am going to, much of the material I will be discussing, as my colleagues mentioned, are going to reflect the information that's provided in the toolkits that we are going to be publishing later in the coming month. So to get started, heat emergencies. Heat emergencies are situations where extreme heat and humidity create a situation of risk to someone's health. Often this can take the form of heat fatigue, heat stroke, dehydration, and other serious health conditions. The federal government at heat.gov describes extreme heat as 2 or more days of temperatures above 90 degrees Fahrenheit or 32 degrees Celsius. Next slide. That being said, different places have different normal climates, and sometimes the other definition that is sometimes used is extreme heat, meaning heat that is unusually hot for the place where people live. Some people do live in places in hotter regions and may be more acclimated, may have tools available to them that they're more familiar with to protect against the heat, may know to hydrate more regularly. That can make temperatures that might not be extreme heat for some place like Arizona or Florida may still be extreme heat if you live where I live in Maryland. So there is some what is normal for you, what is not, what is much more than normal for you, but there's also a ceiling on that where above a certain temperature, a lot of the tools we have to keep ourselves cool stop working. So above 100 and I think 110 or 120 is when we get to the very extreme heat situations where many of the tools, even the tools that we're talking about today, may not be as available. This is another area of concern that we won't be able to touch in as much detail during the webinar, but if there is interest in that, we can also have extended discussions. So why is extreme heat dangerous? Heat makes it hard for people's bodies to keep them cool. Our bodies typically do work to keep us cool. We sweat. Our sweat is a big part of that. When we sweat, we do lose water. We also lose electrolytes. Electrolytes are chemicals that our body needs to function. Electrolytes are really important for our muscles to function and for our brain to transmit signals. So if we lose enough electrolytes, it can also cause other health problems. More people die from heat than other weather-related emergencies, and I think this is very notable. I think people are very familiar with the dangers around cold, but heat is not necessarily as central an area of people's awareness as the dangers of cold. So the fact that more people do die from heat is something that we should really keep in mind. the risk of heat is not distributed evenly. Some people are at more risk from heat than others. Older people, um, children, people with disabilities, um, peop so yeah, some groups, either because of physical medical conditions, may not retain water as well, may be more dehydrated to begin with. Um, Children also often have uh, experienced the impacts faster than other people, than older people. People with disabilities we'll be talking a lot more about during this presentation, obviously. There are also people who's have, because of how they live, work, play, what they're doing, may have other risks. People who work outside, are at more risk. People who are homeless are often will be living in places where they can't control the temperatures they're exposed to. Likewise, people in institutions and prisons don't have control over their environment. They may not have access to cooling systems, to air conditioning. Those things also put them at risk. And then people who are in hotter climates, hotter places, people who live in places that are impacted by global warming, are also going to have more risk because of those higher temperatures, which may become unusually high for what has been the historic norm. So let's talk about people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, which was the focus of this project. Um, People with intellectual and developmental disabilities are at more risk of heat than emergencies and people without. Um, that being said, people do not think about people with IDD when thinking about heat risks. We heard a bit about that in the introduction. It's also the case that when we do, even within discussions about disability, IDD is not top of mind for heat emergency planning. There are a number of reasons why people with IDD face greater risk. One is there are co-occurring medical conditions. Some medical conditions do impact people's heat tolerance. Um, there are some conditions that autistic people are more likely to experience that impact how their body regulates temperature, regulates itself, and that can also impact how they regulate how the body cools itself too. There are also a lot of medications that also change how the body regulates itself in this way. So some medications will warn you that they impact heat tolerance. Some impact heat tolerance, and it's not necessarily as well known or as advertised. So this is, and it may not be in all people either. So this is often a very individualized things, but there are some medications that put people at greater risk. The other factor that puts people with IDD at greater risk for heat is their living, social and living conditions. People with IDD are less likely to have secure housing and more likely to be homeless. That means that they are less likely to have, when that's the case, they are less likely to be able to have access to cooling. They're also more likely to live in group settings, in institutions or group homes. Um, those are also places where they may not have direct control over the heating or cooling of their environments. They may not have enough heating or cooling depending on how the setting is set up. They may not be able to make the individual changes they need to protect themselves. This is also another factor related to this is a lot of people in congregate settings may not have complete control over their daily schedule. They may not be able to do individualized things. If things like day programs and congregate community events where people are brought on an activity as a group, those can also be situations where if somebody isn't feeling well or is concerned about the heat, they may not have the option to opt out or to stay indoors. And that also means that they may be at greater risk of experiencing a heat problem because they don't have the chance to say, no, I don't want to do this. I don't feel good. I'm worried about the heat. Working conditions is another thing. Again, this is, I think, a place that people don't necessarily think about when they think about people with disabilities. But many of us work. But there are certain types of work that people with IDD are more likely to do. Those include things like um, custodial work, cleaning, gardening, landscaping, what's called light factory work, where you're assembling something. Some of those are outdoor jobs, which have all the risks of outdoor jobs, where they may not have opportunity, they will be outdoors for longer, they may not be able to cool. And even those indoor jobs that I described are often in factory type settings where there isn't as much cooling built into that workplace. So in those cases, people are more at risk of having problems with heat. And then the next thing we want to touch on is communication. This is another big reason that our community is more at risk. It's very hard to get help if you are having a health emergency and can't effectively tell people. So there are members of our community who have communication disabilities, may need assistance or tools to communicate. They may not have those tools. They may not have, they may communicate in ways other than language. a- and those can make it harder for people to recognize when someone is communicating that they're having a heat-related problem. Especially when the other thing that can happen is outside of intentional behavior, someone, when they're having a medical emergency, when they're feeling ill, their behavior may change, and that could be communication. It could also be a symptom. Um, and those can be seen as challenging behaviors rather than a sign of an emergency. And in those cases, again, it delays response and can prevent somebody from getting help when they're experiencing an emergency. And then closely related to that, I think the last big risk that we want to highlight here, and a big part of the purpose of this presentation and of the future resources that we will be publishing, is knowledge about heat dangers. As we've mentioned, throughout this presentation so far, there isn't a lot of knowledge about how dangerous heat is. Members of our community are often not educated on what to look out for, what to think about, how to keep themselves safe. Providers and caregivers don't always have the information that they need to make sure that they know the signs to look for. They're able to assist us in having in protecting ourselves when there's very bad heat. The, to know when to avoid outdoors activities because it's dangerous. And likewise, providers. This is also an area where there is a need for just greater education. That's both providers within settings, but also individual support providers. It's very important that people be able to support people and also give them the information they need to stay safe. So for all those reasons, we see an urgent need to provide these resources, ensure that we have the tools to protect ourselves, and that we can also look, as my colleague presenting next is going to um, go over some of the systemic reforms that we can also advocate for um, to ensure that our community is safe from heat. So I will turn it back to Herman to talk about some of the ways we can protect our communities.
This is Herman. Thank you so much, Greg, for all that wonderful and critical information to know. And as Greg mentioned, I'll start going into protecting our communities. These are a series of universal strategies that we recommend across all risk factors. The policy brief goes over numerous of them. They're not all, but all the risk factors. But we do want to make sure that we highlight a number of universal factors that should be adopted and implemented by all. I'll go over a presentation summarizing what we're calling Cooling the Crisis, a policy brief on protecting people with IDD from heat emergencies. Next slide, please. I'll go over an overview of making heat risks less risky. This will look at heat risk factors, short and long-term heat strategies for advocates and public health. And we will, throughout the policy brief, we focus on the heat effects on people with IDD, as Greg mentioned, is the focus of this project. Next slide, please. We want to go over what in the policy brief, the very first section are definitions, and a couple we want to elevate. Prevention, means stopping, right? We want to prevent the effects of extreme heat on people with disabilities in our communities. Heat-related illness and death does not have to happen as much as it is happening, as Greg mentioned, is the #1 climate-related killer. Sometimes kills more people in a year than tornadoes, flooding, and tornadoes combined. This is stoppable. Advocates, including lawyers and people who make policymakers, and public health need to be educated about what heat is and how to fix this. Next slide, please. Policy and risk reduction. Throughout the policy brief, we look at policies and define them as rules and laws that the government makes. These agreements can be changed to protect the health and safe lives of people with IDD during extreme heat. That is why advocacy is so important, and why the policy brief is not only for general consumption, but also with a specific focus on with plain language, so people with all types of understanding can be able to advocate fully as they desire. Next slide, please. In heat risk strategies, advocates, including lawyers, people who make policy, and public health officials, they can stop people from being hurt by heat, right? They can do this by making sure that people with IDD are part of planning and lead the planning talks and meetings. Not only being invited to the table, which means making sure that it is accessible in all the ways to reach and be at the table, but also lead the conversations and are active participants. And this is, again, a universal design throughout all areas of heat mitigation and planning. Next slide, please. We need to make sure that people with IDD also are part of other groups that may not be treated fairly. We're thinking of intersectionality here. For example, people of color, LGBTQIA+, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transsexual, queer, intersex and asexual, and figure out who is not, quote unquote, at the table, and making sure that they are welcomed. Next slide. Within universal heat risk strategies, we encourage all to listen to the experiences of people with IDD particularly who have experienced also a disaster, and support the leadership of people with IDD who have experienced a disaster, supporting them in understanding the situation, the existing risks, and together figuring out ways that they can contribute. However, they may want to the level that at the moment is needed, and this can change, right? We all have different feelings throughout the year, especially when thinking about disasters, and that sometimes causes some, reliving that experience. That can be sometimes difficult. So giving grace and space for that as well through these conversations is important. Next slide, please. We need to make sure the people with IDD also are part of other groups that may not be treated fairly, as I mentioned earlier, and start partnerships between government agencies and trusted organizations that work directly with marginalized communities, right? Public health, government officials, lawmakers, and us advocates, we all focus in our areas, and we need to be successful. It needs to be, as a term in emergency management, a whole community involvement, and cross-movement collaboration will support further leaving no one behind, especially people with IDD of intersecting identities. Next slide, please. Within we also need to make sure that the planning process is accessible to disabled people. And in the slide deck, it'll be linked, but also in the policy brief, ASAN's inclusive meetings, the Autistic Self Advocacy Network's Community Living Summit, series of tools that support your accessible planning approaches. And we at the partnership also have a resource we named Making Virtual Meetings and Events Accessible. We encourage you all to navigate these resources along the many footnotes in the policy brief to expand your education in this area. Next slide, please. Look for ways for advocates, including lawyers and policymakers, and public health to reduce heat risk. This may look like compensating paying people with IDD who are also members of other groups who aren't treated fairly to take on decision-making roles, increasing the representation and thoughtfulness of your planning. Next slide, please. Also, get groups to work together in a big group, which are often called coalitions. Again, we should not be working in our own spaces all by ourselves, but collaborating across, as I mentioned, the whole community. Think whoever that may be and who is not included, and look for the representation to be at the table, and elevating the disability justice principles of those most impacted and interdependence, making sure that those most impacted are leading, like people with IDD, with other intersecting identities, and collaborating across movements, and knowing that none of us can do it alone, and in collaboration we can make sure that no one is left behind. And these coalitions should include organizations that people trust and government agencies, such as public health and emergency management. Right there are some sectors that are trusted more than others, and in the height of the COVID-19 public health emergency, it was well documented that working with trusted community leaders and trusted community organizations, this is specific to public health and government officials, in collaborating with community-based organizations that are trusted, will get a bigger reach and impact, which is our goal ultimately. Next slide, please. require that heat plans and policies explicitly address the compounded risks created by disability, race, poverty, housing instability, gender identity, and other intersecting forms of oppression. We cover a number of this in the policy brief in more detail, but knowing that these compounding social dynamics further amplify the effects of ableism for people with disabilities, and in some cases, that much more for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Next slide, please. Make sure that all heat communications and materials are always accessible. This looks like creating multiple formats, including plain language, easy read, multiple languages, and large print. And part of multiple languages, understand your hyper local community needs, right? At the zip code, at the very local neighborhood level, and making sure that there is education material, so they are informed, can prepare, and understand what to do in case of a disaster, and are able to understand what resources are for the response and how can they qualify, and who can support them in case they may need that support. We all need support, and especially after a disaster, regardless of where before the disaster, it is a traumatic experience, and we all need support and deserve it. And supporting each other is also part of that critical step. And requiring vendors and partners to meet these standards, right? Not only should public health, emergency management, the government make sure that all communications are accessible, but as they contract out and bring in other partners, they need to make sure that they follow these standards as well. Next slide, please. Again, for advocates, lawyers, public health officials, we all need to develop a plan to reach out to the community when a heat emergency happens. And again, that communication needs to be accessible in all formats and multiple. Making sure that these plans include outreach to people with IDD and other groups that are treated unfairly. And regularly share accessible materials in accordance with this plan. And as you're developing the plan, bringing in subject matter experts, people with IDD and with lived experience, to be able to, before you roll it out, test it, making sure that it lands well, that it's well received and understood by the communities that you're intending to reach. Next slide, please. Within heat risk factors, certain conditions, and earlier Greg went through numerous ones, increase the risk of heat-related illness and death for people with IDD. These include, additionally, intersectional oppression, meaning when people with IDD belong to multiple groups that are treated unfairly, they're more in danger from heat than otherwise. In the policy brief, we in great detail go into this and briefly discussed earlier. Next slide, please. Some of these include poverty, schools without adequate cooling, being unhoused, prisons and jails, segregated congregate settings, including but certainly not limited to institutions nursing facilities. Again, compounded effects, not always intersect, but do create similar oppression and at different degrees. And when you're in these types of situations without receiving adequate supports, without understanding sometimes why you're in that situation, what services can support you there and help you transition to better spaces you may want to be in. All of this rarely is an information that is in plain language, easy to read in multiple languages. So it further exacerbates their experience and increases the likelihood of not exiting this social dynamic, sadly. We need to focus on these communities because oftentimes they are, again, the most impacted throughout heat emergencies. Next slide, please. Additional strategies to address risk factors. There are long-term and short-term strategies that address specific risk factors in the toolkit and the policy brief. And these factors may be different for advocacy and public health, but oftentimes they also resonate with each other. Next slide. And ways to lower heat risks. There are strategies that advocates and public health can use to lessen the risks. Some are universal, as we have gone through, and in the policy brief, you'll see specific ones, but these apply in most risks. And please, in the coming weeks, stay tuned for, and again, a fully accessible in multiple formats toolkit and policy brief with much more. Do want to recognize that extreme heat causes numerous other types of disasters for our community. One particularly being power outages. This is a common denominator throughout most types of disasters and hazards. So planning properly, and there are numerous recommendations that take into account the potential for power outages and ways to prepare and mitigate during power outages. Much more, but please stay tuned. I want to invite Colin and Greg to join me and potentially add more that I may have missed. And we can also go over some of your questions that you would like us to begin addressing.
This is Priya as Colin and Greg join Herman here. I have a couple of questions in the Q&A. And as a reminder for folks, please do feel free to ask your questions as these resources are really for our communities to use. And so we want to hear from you. The first question is, are there any states that have laws about heat risk? And
this is where I'll begin taking that question, and then I'll pass it to Greg and Colin. Every state has a heat mitigation plan. To what degree does it include the needs of people with disabilities, specifically the needs of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities? Oftentimes, that level of the plan is not public, and we have not seen a city that holistically take into account our needs. So there are many points in the policy brief suggestions to begin addressing this as policy actions.
I guess the one thing I would add there is I think this is also an area where we are seeing developing state action. Most notably, I know a number of states in the last couple of years, including my state, Maryland, have developed workplace heat standards. Again, I think there's really critical importance here to ensure that disability inclusion is part of that planning process because we know that the types of occupations where that people with disabilities frequently work are higher risk. So, um,
One thing also just to add is in terms of like, because a lot of this policy really does happen at down, even not even below the state level, right, at the municipal level, right? And one thing is, a lot of municipalities and we're relying on is cooling centers, right? And these are usually sort of existing buildings that are being repurposed, places with air conditioning, often, school gymnasiums, that kind of thing, right? And so accessibility of those spaces becomes really important to consider, right? If they're relying on the idea that people who don't have access to an air-conditioned space can go to a cooling center. Is the cooling center accessible? Is there accessible transportation to the cooling center? Is the way that the cooling center is publicized accessible? Can people who go there, are there accessible communication options for them, et cetera? So that's one key piece of this too.
This is Priya. Thank you all. Lots of questions coming in. We love to see it. I want to jump to a question from Elizabeth asking, would this be a topic good for us to develop social stories in English and our other community languages? I would also add, how can we use stories to further advocacy efforts in creating heat mitigation strategies?
This is Herman. Peer-to-peer learning from each other. We find in the disability community to be a pillar in succeeding in this ableist society. So storytelling, sharing success and also struggles, finding community through the difficulties sometimes also can bring support. Um, so yes and yes, and understanding to that second part on language, understanding your communities, the languages they speak, and sign also, right? Not always is it American Sign Language, but meeting with the deaf community and understanding what are the type of sign language used, and that locality will also increase your outreach.
I will add, I think social stories and that community engagement is really valuable here especially on the local level. Speaking, um, one piece of feedback we got while we were developing this is some of our some of our advisory committee members were from agricultural communities where the impact on heat for both farm labor and for the availability of work both were impacted by extreme heat. But that was a community of interest for like getting this information out because that was a lot of the work around there. Um, Similarly, in my work prior to ASAN, I did some work with in Philadelphia, sharing this information with daycare providers who um, needed to have this information um, for outdoors, like for managing outdoor activities for those daycares. So there was a very specific need that we were able to meet by connecting this issue to what the community had what it needed and where the risk was. So I think that's a really important part of the social story work when addressing sort of heat safety is matching to that community need. Um,
Yeah, no, I think it's Herman and Greg said it really well. I think just like money's got to be spent on this fundamentally, and policymakers need to be able to, when they're making decisions about how to spend money, to think of the specific person they talked to know how that will affect them, right? And the more low level you get, the fewer stories you need to have that kind of impact.
and to clarify, because I do see that question, this was prior to my work at ASAN. This was before I was particularly active doing disability work. This was public health work, and it was focused on daycares. But at the same time, their needs were what was identified locally. There are obviously you want to tailor to the community, and while we didn't have the same disability focus that we really were able to include in this, and I think that's we have a different audience and a different sort of we're trying to reach different people, and I think that again speaks to how like where that important tailoring lies. So.
This is Priya, and I think that also speaks to Herman's earlier point of working across silos. And this is something that we touch in the policy brief as well. A lot of the strategies mentioned are obviously intentionally focused for our communities, for the IDD community, but it talks very much about working in coalition and working across fields, as it were. With that, I want to address and highlight that these resources, the policy brief and the toolkit will be available in the coming weeks and month or so as we get them up on both the partnerships website as well as ASAN's website. And of course, for those who are all registered here, you will be receiving an email when those resources are ready. But then, of course, please do make sure to follow us on on all of our platforms on social media, as we will be sharing it broadly there as well. With that, I want to turn to a question from Rosemary. Excuse me, I'm sorry. I want to turn to a question from June before we get too far into it. We talked a lot about easy to read resources, plain language resources, and I am wondering if I can sort of call on our colleagues and friends over at ASAN to share what is the difference between these resources.
Yeah, I can get to that. So, easy read is sort of a kind of plain language that sort of further is even more accessible. Plain language writing focuses on using simple language that is easy to understand, having short sentences without complex grammar, using words that if people talk about grade level of reading, it's a little reductive, but trying generally to use simple language that most people would understand, and making sure that it often involves defining your words up front. You'll often get a long list of definitions at the beginning just to make sure that someone reading the document will understand. Um, and then easy read takes plain language one step further by having visual icons, pictures, or other these specific visual icons to help people connect the sentence to the idea, and having one idea per line specifically to make the document even more accessible, literally easy to read. Greg, I don't know if you have anything you want to add to that.
Yeah, I think Colin covered I think the key pieces. The idea is to keep sentences simple, for plain language you want to limit it to really one idea per sentence, not have complex or run-on sentences. Really define your words. I think especially when we're talking about policy issues, there's often a lot of words that we need to that we do need to use, terminology that we do need to define. So giving a definition, sometimes going beyond that and explaining the underlying concepts if that is not something obvious. If a great example is when we have some resources on Medicaid. But in order to understand what Medicaid is, you have to know what health insurance is. So you have to describe what health insurance is, why people have it, and then what Medicaid is in relationship to insurance. So sometimes you have to back up and explain a few more things to give the context to explain the thing that you're getting to. So it isn't just a machine translation thing either. This is often a how can we unpack this idea in a way that is understandable once you lay it all out. So it is that's a piece that we also really prioritize because it is really important to give the same information to all communities. And if we have to do more explaining to get to the place where we're giving that information, then that's just what we need to do to make it accessible. Um,
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm seeing a question here from Rosemary, asking, can you explain the concept of wet bulb temperature as it pertains to extreme heat emergencies?
uh, I can start that off. I feel like Herman might be more of an expert than I am. So essentially, the wet bulb temperature is the coldest you can get just from the water evaporating off of you. So the best way to think about it is the coldest you could get just from sweating. Um, so if you think about that, that means if it's very humid, you're not gonna your sweat isn't gonna evaporate as quickly, so you won't get as cold. Um, so that's one reason when we get to very high temperatures and very high humidity, it can be dangerous because sweat is the main method our body uses to cool itself off. If the water on our skin can't evaporate, it won't cool us off. Um, and it's called wet bulb because they actually take it in the thermometer and wrap it in like a wet cloth, and they measure that temperature. So I think I have that all right, Herman. If there's anything you wanted to add.
This is someone that was very well explained. No, I might use that. I liked it. So that's right on. Thank you, Greg.
Absolutely. And this ties into a question I'm seeing from Rose, sharing first, some cities were built with no air conditioning, but with climate change, air conditioning is now needed. Berkeley, California is such a city, and it's getting hotter. What are people supposed to do if apartment buildings don't have AC?
I can start this one off. This is actually something you'll see we talk about in the brief. That, yeah, I mean, so this is a real problem, and access to air conditioning is a healthcare need for a lot of people with disabilities. Now, the in general, right, what people do when they live in a building that doesn't have built-in AC and they need access to air conditioning is they use portable air conditioners or window units. But of course, those are expensive, right? They often cost several $100s, and it's not something people just necessarily have out of pocket. And so one thing we talk about in the brief is the need for both more state Medicaid agencies to be willing to pay for someone to get a portable air conditioner where there is a medical need for it, as well as the general expansion of state programs that provide assistance in heating, right, in getting access to heaters, to also support paying for access to air conditioning where that is appropriate. So yeah, it's really critical. I mean, there's not a lot that people necessarily can do as individuals to access air conditioning if they can't afford it, but this is an area where we really need to push policymakers to make it more available.
I will say one thing that Colin did mention that is something to explore. Um, my understanding is what's called LIHEAP. It's low income. I always get it confused on the EAP. It is low income home energy assistance program. This is a federal program that is supposed to be available in every state that provides assistance with energy bills as well as heating and cooling energy costs. So that is something that you can explore for assistance on um, financial assistance to cool in at least in warmer states. I think one tricky thing is states that are further north tend to use their light heat funding for heating and may not have cooling as an option. That's something that is can be a little state by state, but that is something that you can should be able to apply to within your state. If you're familiar with like your housing assistance, community development corporations, those organizations will often help people apply for LIHEAP. However, this is also an area where we have really struggled with the federal government being very slow to fund this and trying to the most recent president's budget has proposed eliminating this. This is an area where advocacy is also really, really valuable to ensure that LIHEAP remains available to our communities. So,
This is Herman. If you, as Colin and Greg shared, in critical systems advocacy and potential resources to support um, some immediate steps. If it's being informed, signing up to local weather alerts, and making sure that way you can know ahead of time if there is a extreme heat event coming. If you are aware of this and informed, a recommendation is to begin, and let's call it overly hydrating, drinking a little bit more water than you normally would before, ahead of the heat emergency, and as much as possible, remaining well hydrated, and eating as you can also, salts and such during the extreme heat event. During extreme heat event, this is accompanied by nights that are not cooling off, so you're not able to feel better and cool off at night. So take that into account, plan for this if possible. And part of being informed is looking at what cooling centers might be. It might not even be called a cooling center, but public libraries, sometimes if around your neighborhood, malls, looking for places that would have air conditioning for those hottest times of the day that you can at least try to keep your body cool.
This is thank you. And just for access, the program mentioned is LIHEAP, LIHEAP, and that stands for Low Income Home Energy Assistance.
This is Herman, and all do note that there will be specific information about LIHEAP and air conditioning in the toolkit forthcoming.
Absolutely. And since we're talking about air conditioning, we have a question here asking about the difference between a portable air conditioner versus a fan in terms of efficacy in a heat emergency.
Greg, you want to start us off? You're on mute. You're sharing.
sure, that is a really great question. I think this is something that is important to be aware of. As we discussed a little earlier when we were talking about wet bulb, most of what your body does to cool itself is the water on your skin evaporating. Fans can help with that, but when you're dealing with extreme heat and those high wet bulb temperatures, that evaporation is slowed. And so fans, when it's very hot, a fan may not be helpful in cooling you if you're at risk of extreme heat. And in those cases, you do need air conditioning to actually lower the temperature and lower that dry bulb temperature to a point where your body can cool itself. When you're in those very hot, very humid circumstances, the fan actually there's some I don't know that the exact sort of what point this is hits, but like there are temperature conditions where the fan is even potentially counterproductive. It may make you feel cooler without actually cooling you, and that may be more dangerous. So when we're talking extreme heat, when we're talking temperatures that where that evaporation cooling isn't happening, then you do need those air conditioners um, to cool. So I think that's the key piece that is really important to know.
Yeah, just to emphasize, like air conditioners actually lower the temperature of the air in the room and they reduce the humidity. So they also increase your ability. They both actually make the air cooler and they make your sweating more effective by making the room less humid. So they're helping. A portable air conditioner is working multiple ways. For an air conditioner to be effective, it actually has to be able to push the warm air outside, right? That's why they have to be set up in windows, right? You can't stick a portable air conditioner in the middle of a room unless it's got a hose that goes to the outside.
Thank you so much. I'm seeing quite a few questions here, sort of asking um, how to some strategies, if you will, to create coalitions for emergency planning that is both inclusive to people with disabilities and people with IDD. And also seeing a question here on how USAIDs can also get involved and perhaps even when talking about the strategies, where to find information on creating such coalitions.
This is Herman, and you said it's like UCEDD, University Centers on Excellence on Developmental Disabilities. Okay, I'll get us started. And we talk about it in the policy brief extensively. Find where people are, collaborate with people with disabilities. Um, if you need support on how to reach people with disabilities, right? Surely ASAN and also the partnership can support at the local level, or at the state level. You have your developmental disability councils that can support. At the more local level, you have centers for independent living that can support identifying cross disability individuals to support with your planning. Um, there are different groups, sometimes more disability focused, but we encourage people to be as cross disability as possible to get, that that wholeness, that whole community input.
And just there are also organizations that aren't disability focused, but are working around issues of like heat and housing, for instance, that you might be able to go to and say, hey, people with disabilities have specific concerns here and kind of show them our policy brief, for instance, like tenant groups, right? Groups organizing people who live in public housing, for instance, might, a lot of places would be organizing around like access um, to air conditioning, for instance, or like housing groups, focus on like affordable housing more generally. Those might be good places to go. Some like if there are like climate related organizations, right? Obviously, a lot of those is sort of larger policy focused, but there are organizations dedicated to dealing with the local impacts of climate change, and some of those might be good places to talk to as well.
Yeah, I would say again, housing related, community development, the energy assistance organizations are often again very tied up in this work on the community level. I will also say the work I mentioned the work I did prior to ASAN on this. That was through my public health program. Public health partners are very heavily engaged here. And on that note, I do want to make sure folks know that this May, probably around the time we will have our resources out, The week of May 18th to 22nd is National Heat Safety Week. So I know a number of public health partners are also engaging on this work. And I'm happy to share, I'll share the American Public Health Association's page on this. It is, I will disclaim, it is not plain language, but it does go over what public health activities are happening. And that's another set of groups that you can engage with and reach out who are really interested in this. And I think it is really, as much as our brief is directed at policymakers and encouraging disability inclusion, I think as disability organizations, we can also be the ones doing that outreach to these partners and making sure that they're thinking about our communities when setting policies. So let me share this if this goes to chat, hopefully, if this goes to everybody, hopefully. I'll send it to everyone. There we go.
Yes, Priya, thanks, Greg, for sharing that resource in chat. And I'm seeing thanks from folks for sharing this information. I'm seeing here a question from Gloria asking, where can we find examples of good policies to address extreme heat, especially for protecting individuals who are homeless?
This is Herman. I would encourage to stay tuned for the resources in the public brief, in the policy brief. We include a number of resources that have been proven. So not only best recommendations, but proven practices. We did the research for you. It's coming to you in a few weeks.
Absolutely. I'm seeing a question here from Jim related to a larger question, a couple questions here, but one larger question related to communication. Of course, Jim starts with, don't forget that there are deaf people with IDD and traditional ASL might not always work for them and with them. Their caregivers usually have specialized communication skills that they developed between the two of them. 2 or 3 deaf people have died during the heat dome event in Washington State in 2021. Jim goes on to say, part of me thinks that's due to inaccessible information and that they did not know how to prepare themselves for heat. Jim asks, what types of language approaches do you recommend when working with individuals with different communication styles?
So I'll lead off here because I think one thing we have really emphasized in our across our work is the importance of plain language. I think there are two very key pieces of this. Is not only is it more accessible for people with IDD who benefit from plain language directly, it also makes it much easier to translate materials between languages. If you're using simple words and simple concepts and short sentences, it is a lot easier to translate between languages or if into a cross communication style. The more elaborate, jargony, complex the language is, the harder it is to do that. And I think that is a universal design principle. So that's one thing that I really try to highlight. I don't know if Hermione, you have other thoughts there, but I do think that's a real. I really appreciate that point because I think the intersection of communication disabilities associated with IDD and additional and the deaf community, I think like the way that intersects is something that does require a lot of consideration about ensuring effective communication. So I really appreciate that point.
Colin, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think Greg mostly said it, but also just right to, giving people the ability to type to communicate, right? Making sure that people can, text, for instance, right, and get, communicate with people that way. Um, just having as many like modalities of communication open as possible, knowing that there's no single mode that's going to work for everybody.
I'll briefly add, attempt not using euphemisms. That that it, that is difficult oftentimes, um, and also, when you look at the definition of a word, and there's like multiple definitions, attempt to use again everyday words, and focusing on that first definition and not like the third, because then in translation that might not work. Just a few tips there. All great points.
This is pretty, I absolutely, and something I'm hearing and really want to highlight is just working with the individual. There's not, like Colin said, there's not going to be one approach that fits all. So tailoring communication styles and language approaches to individuals as much as possible. This is Priya as we are approaching the last 10 minutes of the webinar. Please feel free to continue asking your questions. This has been a phenomenal discussion thus far. And we have time for a few more questions. So don't hesitate to put those in the Q&A box or perhaps in chat if that's more accessible to you. And again, please do feel free to email us those questions if that's most accessible. And that email is Priya, Priya, at disasterstrategies.org. This is Priya. I see a question here, sort of broadly speaking to a lot of what our resources, upcoming resources, as well as this webinar have touched on, but curious if folks want to share a bit more on how these IDD heat issues differ than heat issues related to people with disabilities as a general community, given that IDD is such a broad group of people.
I can start off. I think it's a great question, and there's lots of overlap, right? Like people with physical disabilities are also often going to have, significant issues with, being at greater risk from heat because of, impacts of medical conditions, right? And of course, lots of people are in both categories, right? Lots of people have both an intellectual developmental disability and a physical disability. Some developmental disabilities cause physical disabilities. I think the big thing here that is not unique to people who have IDD, but it, for instance, also overlaps with deaf people, as we were discussing before, is information accessibility being key here. And that's part of why we did this project specifically, is because.
Priya, I'm just going to interrupt Colin. If we could slow down just a little bit,
Sorry.
that would be phenomenal. Thank you.
My apologies. I get when I am talking about subjects I'm excited about, I speed up sometimes. I appreciate the note. Um, Information accessibility is, I think, one of the really important pieces here, right? That there are the inherent risks posed by heat, and then those are made worse when information about how to stay safe is not provided in accessible formats, right? Or when people aren't able to communicate accessibly that they are experiencing symptoms of extreme heat, or where ways that people could contact their speak to their legislators about the importance of this issue are inaccessible for reasons of communication. So that, I think, is the biggest one. Is there are other things as well. There are, certain industries where, because of the legacy of um, sheltered workshops and things like that, that people with IDD are more likely to work in certain fields where they're exposed to heat. But I think information accessibility is the big one.
Colin stole the words out of my mouth. I think that was what I was going to highlight is communication accessibility and both ensuring that people are able to communicate when they're in distress, but also that they have the information that they're provided the information and tools in an accessible manner to um, protect themselves, and that their supporters are also given that information. I think that's to me the piece that I think is most key as a distinct as much as any of these issues are distinct. I think that's one of the key ones. Um,
This is Herman. I would briefly add, and taking this from perhaps a different angle, because everything I agree fully with Colin and Greg, says we are interacting with anyone taking time to check our own biases and leave them at the door and not bring him in your communication to the individual, whatever that may be. We all have a dignity of risk, and not stripping away our right is critical. And part of that is that informed decision making. So communication is at the heart of it.
I will add one more thing, and it's also related to this the communication point, that a ongoing, really serious problem with care generally for members of the community, IDD community, especially those of us who don't use speech to communicate, is recognizing, treating all changes in behavior as acting out. Um, that's a real risk when there is a risk of there being a medical event, and that not being interpreted or read correctly or understood as a form of when it's a form of communication, not understood as that when it's a sign of a health event, not not having vigilance for that. I think that's another piece of this that I think is really important for. Um, I really want to make sure people come away with awareness of that in heat conditions, they do need to be aware that a change in behavior could be a sign that someone has a medical need and doesn't need, rather than um, a behavior needing a behavioral intervention.
This is Priya. What an important point. Thank you for adding that, Greg. I'm seeing a question in chat asking, what should be the strategy of cooling where there is no electricity?
This is Herman. That goes into a systemic problem that needs to be addressed with the emergency management, perhaps / disaster risk reduction, whatever you may be working equivalent, because they are to support the cooling center, and part of it is being able to provide cooling, and without electricity, that can be difficult, if not impossible, in some situations. So that if that is recognized, that there needs to be an intervention with the emergency management to support the cooling center further, or the public health agency.
Yeah. If this is a regional issue, I think there are going to be limits to what's available, especially in very extreme heat where we do run out of cooling options. Where possible, cold water and ice can assist. Shade can help somewhat up to a point. If this is a systemic issue, a regional issue, things like thermal curtains to block the sun during the day can help cool a room. But there are real limits, just as a practical matter. And I think especially something we talk about in our brief, institutions, and include prisons when I talk about institutions. The lack of cooling there is a real problem because of that. So beyond that, I think like if there's an individual lack of electricity, cooling stations are a really valuable resource. So I think that's the other piece that I would add is if it's rather than region wide, we're talking about someone's home or someone's where someone's located, they don't have access to electric cooling, that turning to cooling stations may be the best option if there's extreme heat. So I also saw a question earlier I didn't want to miss about pets and cooling stations. That varies. I always try to distinguish there's pets and then there's assistance animals. As a reasonable accommodation, assistance animal, service animals are should often be available. I will also say Petco provides cooling stations for pets and their families. So if you have a pet, that is one option. If there's a Petco near you, they provide cooling. Um, I did want to make sure I got to that question because I did look up the answer to that while we were talking.
This
This
is
is
Romana. Absolutely has been well documented, particularly in disasters, that people will not leave their pets alone. So, doing all that's possible to make cooling centers accessible to people with disabilities and all pets, and taking into account that, as Greg mentioned, service animals need to be allowed where the person is allowed into any public spaces, and the owner of or the handler of the service animal. Um, but also taking into account that sometimes having animals as pets and service animals in the same space might create some difficulties for the service animal. So cohabitating may be another option that is currently the Red Cross approach to sheltering and pets.
This is what a vital conversation we were able to have today. Thank you all to our presenters, Herman, Colin, and Greg. Thank you for not only walking us through the resources, but also answering questions. And thank you all who were able to join us for asking such phenomenal questions. We have about a minute. And just wanting to uplift once again that the resources will be available in the coming weeks, as will an accessible archive of today's conversation. And that'll be available on the various websites and will be very clearly shared with you all. I also want to take a moment to thank the With Foundation and the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation again for making these resources possible, making it possible for us to share these resources with you all. And of course, thanks to our language access team, for which we would not be able to have this webinar at all. So thank you all once again for joining us, and please do be on the lookout for those resources. Ron, Colin, anything else?
Just thank you. Thank you to everyone who stuck around through this whole thing. I think everyone turned out. This was a great conversation. Look forward to please keep an eye out for the resources coming out in a few weeks, and don't hesitate to reach out if you have further thoughts or ideas about this. Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining us.